Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Ulrich. I am the co-chair or co-dean of the EPA Alumni Academy. My co-dean, Lydia Wegman, joins with me in welcoming all of you to this first session of a new season of EPA Alumni Association Academy programs. We've got a star-studded cast today. We've got another session, a wonderful one, on the Sackett decision and waters of the United States already next week. So I hope you can track that down and join us for that as well. For those of you who may not know, the EPA Alumni Association is a wonderful organization of 2,528 people representing 59,873 years of service to the U.S. government, to U.S. EPA. All you have to do is have been at EPA for a year, and if you're no longer there, you're eligible. Or if you are currently at EPA and retirement eligible, you can join our wonderful organization. Perhaps the best thing about it, in addition to all of the great programming, is it's free. We do ask for donations now and then to keep us going, but there is no required set of dues. Now, with no further ado, I want to move into our program today, and I'm particularly pleased to be a part of this program because I was a part of the cleanup and actually was part of the first round of NPDES permits that were issued to the Fox River back in the early 1970s. A lot has happened since then, and this is a different kind of a problem. Joining us today are Bill Muno, who joined the agency just a month before I did back in 1973, and Bill and I had the opportunity to work together on a number of matters over the years, and Bill, I think, is one of the most highly regarded senior managers, certainly in the region and in the agency, and really did a marvelous job over the years. Jim Honnenberg, I didn't have as much and as long an opportunity to work with him. We thought that he maybe has retired to Hawaii, but not necessarily.
No.
I guess it's Aurora, Illinois, but Jim was one of our stellar remedial project managers in the Superfund program and spearheaded the technical side of the Fox River cleanup. Roger Grimes and I go back even farther than Bill Muno and I'm not going to go into any details there because I want to protect Roger and me for our reputations and everything else related to it. But Roger joined EPA, I think it was in 1975, and we were both part of the water legal enforcement section at that time, and he had experience across the board in air and then a lot of work in Superfund over the years. So I'm particularly pleased to be working with these three excellent people who committed their lives to environmental protection and the agency over the years, and to share their experiences with one of the largest Superfund cleanups in the country, and certainly one of the largest PCB cleanups. So to start us off will be Bill Muno. And Bill, I will turn it over to you at this point. Take it away.
All right. Thanks very much, Dave. And we're going to take a look at these slides. We'll go full screen. There we are. So anyways, we're going to talk about the cleanup of the PCB sediments in the lower Fox River in Wisconsin. You notice in parentheses, I put the term Paper Valley. Two people that worked quite a bit on this, the reporter from the Green Bay newspaper and staff employee from Fish and Wildlife Service have actually written a book called The Paper Valley. So I stole their title. It's a very interesting book about this whole project, and it's available on Amazon if anyone is really interested in this. Okay, we could go to the next slide. This gives you a little layout of what we were dealing with. This is a 39 mile stretch that goes from Lake Winnebago to Green Bay. If you look at the map of Wisconsin, you kind of see where Green Bay is and how it flows ultimately out into Lake Michigan. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that just doing the original investigation, there were 14 million cubic yards of sediment found. Those are the blue areas on this map. And the little cross hatches are dams of the river. And those dams ultimately broke the river up into what Superfund refers to as operable units. So go to the next slide. And you get a little sense of what we're dealing with here, that there are 7 paper mills. This was the largest concentration of paper mills in the United States. Ultimately, Georgia Pacific bought out several of these. A couple of them went out of business. And in terms of the Superfund cleanup, Pacific, NCR, and P.H. Gladfelter, which was a very small paper company, but it still is in existence. An interesting fact, when I first started working at EPA in 1973, as Dave mentioned, I was given a stack of EPA memo forms. And these were multi-copy forms. And I was told that I had to write a memo using my Skillcraft ballpoint pen. And there was a yellow copy, a pink copy, and a blue copy. And each of those copies contained PCBs. We didn't know then, but my work at EPA was actually part of this problem. The PCBs came from both manufacturing the carbonless copy paper as well as recycling that paper to make new paper. You see that the PCBs discharged primarily through their NPDES permits, which at that time really didn't control PCBs at all. And the group of the 3 paper companies were collectively known as the Fox River Group. So if we go to the next slide, please. There we go. In terms of the risks, if you look at the current risk of cancer was 10 to the minus 3, where Superfund has a risk range of 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 6. And even worse, the hazards index for non-cancer effects, both EPA Superfund uses less than 1, and the calculated risk from non-cancer hazard index was 50 to 70. So the PCBs were causing a serious problem in the entire 39-mile stretch of the Fox River. If we go to the next slide, please. And this gives you some sense of the eco effects of the PCBs. Survival and reproduction on mammals, birds, and fish. You know, they say how the PCBs start with the invertebrates and move up through the food chain. You can see this cormorant with a cross bill again, and also serious PCBs in the fatty parts of fish, primarily walleye, that predominate in the Fox River. So if we go to the next slide, please. There we go. So what's the best solution? So let's go to the next one. We have, there's only 3 things that you could do. Either you could cap it, you could dredge it, or you can count on natural recovery, which is simply allowing clean sediments to cover the contaminated sediments. And it turns out that the remedy that ultimately I'll talk about, and Jim will as well, is really a combination of all 3 of these. So next slide. Originally, the paper companies certainly didn't want to spend a lot of money, and they were really pushing hard for a capping proposal. Dredging obviously is much more expensive. They really felt this quote expert panel was really trying to slant the deck in their favor to minimize as much dredging as possible. So let's go to the next one, please. We did do a couple of that we call them demonstration projects using dredging early on in the process. These were really small projects, but it did prove that dredging certainly was possible. It was an effective way for removing a lot of PCBs. And you can see on this photo a very small hydraulic dredge on the back of a flatbed truck. Ultimately, the dredges that were used were mounted on bars significantly larger. But let's go to the next slide. Here we go with our proposed plan was hydraulic dredging with off-site disposal and then monitored natural recovery. And although this didn't mention capping at the time, I'll get into the fact that later on down the road, we did amend the original ROD to allow capping of certain lower concentration areas of sediment in the river. So let's go to the next slide. As we issued the proposed plan, we got a significant number of comments. Some people said that the cleanup level was too low. A lot of the indigenous people and fishermen on the river, certainly the paper companies, said it was way too high. We did include Green Bay as one of the operable units of the site, but many people felt that we should do a lot more in terms of removing sediments in Green Bay. I think we could go to the next slide. I'll skip over the last 2 points. While this whole thing was going on, the National Academy of Sciences, National Resource Council, did a study of PCBs, and they ultimately prepared a, you can see this, a 400-page report on PCBs. I was asked to provide input to them. I did a presentation at their request on the economic impacts of dredging. But some of the key points in this report, which ultimately influenced EPA's first national sediment cleanup standards, was that obviously PCBs have human health risks and ecological impacts. That's about as obvious as it could be. That the solutions need to be site specific. That the cleanups have to be risk-based. Community involvement, they felt, was critical, and that in selecting any type of a cleanup remedy, that you have to consider both the economic impacts and the impacts on the people that live in the area. So if we go to the next slide. The remedy that ultimately we selected was certainly risk-based. We did have a large amount of community involvement with all the stakeholders, the state of Wisconsin, the natural resource damage trustees, which included primarily Fish and Wildlife and 2 tribes. We had a technical assistant group grant awarded to local environmental groups, and we published a regular newsletter. Had a cute name called the Fox River Current. And we did release a draft RIFS for comment early on in the process, and the Economic and societal impacts were evaluated through the natural resource damage assessment, where we had a large number of trustees, like I said, the state, the tribes, and Fish and Wildlife. So go to the next slide, please. And here's the national settlement principles, which kind of tie into what the National Resource Council recommended we do. That's an iterative process. And when you have a large sediment site such as this, you can't sort of solve the problem in one fell swoop. By iterative process, there might be need for some removal actions, some Superfund early actions, maybe some remedial response work, and then go back and reevaluate the risks and see if additional work is necessary. So that's what they meant by the National Resource, the iterative process. Then the societal and economic impacts, like I said, are covered by the Natural Resource Damage Assessment process, where all the trustees, EPA not being a trustee, but pretty much everyone else that had an interest was involved. We had considerable stakeholder involvement, meetings, newsletters. The decision was certainly risk-based, and this site is a mega site. Superfund internally defined a mega site as any remedy that costs over $50 million. Well, it turns out that this remedy ultimately was closer to $1 billion, so it was a mega site, and we did consult frequently with headquarters to make sure we were being consistent with work that was being done also in the Hudson River, Region 2, and the Housatonic River in Region 1. So if we go to the next slide. This is, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, that we did the remedial investigation and risk assessment, which is kind of the first step in the Superfund remedial process. And this is an interesting thing because the PRP group, the Fox River group, said that they were willing to do a remedial investigation and risk assessment. They did it, and not surprisingly, they had almost no dredging. They wanted to go with capping and monitored natural recovery. And we presented a lot of comments. We had numerous meetings over the risk assessment assumptions, and ultimately they would not budge. So we essentially threw away their RI and risk assessment, and we used our Superfund contractors to do our own, which was the basis for our ROD. If you notice on the bottom, ultimately we went out for the proposed plan in January of 2002. We had 48,000 comments, and as required by Superfund in responsive summary, we had to respond to each of those 4,800 comments. So it was just an unbelievable amount of work to get to the ROD stage. So go to the next slide. Fortunately, we did complete the ROD December of 2002. I actually signed that myself after I retired in 04. As the cleanup was progressing, they found that there were some areas of contaminated sediments that probably were more amenable to capping than dredging. So they amended the ROD in 08 to allow some additional capping for the remedy. And then in 2020, the cleanup was essentially completed, that all the remedial work that needed to be done was completed. If you go to the next slide, we'll leave this to I think for Roger to comment on, but just to note that we did get DOJ was very much involved in this, and we did have a consent decree that was filed in federal court, lodged with the court, went through the 30-day public comment period, and finally approved by a federal court judge, which sort of made this agreement enforceable. We'll go to the next slide, please. Obviously, we wanted to list this site on the NPL. It certainly was NPL caliber. But to list a site on the NPL, you need the concurrence of the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin was extremely protective of the paper companies, did not want the site listed on the NPL, and Superfund doesn't require the site to be on the NPL to take a Superfund enforcement action or to do a response action. And ultimately, all this was done without ever listing the site on the NPL. If we go to the next screen. And then to talk about the Wisconsin EPA partnership. WDNR insisted on taking the technical lead. Like I said, they were somewhat protective of paper companies. In fact, the WDNR appointed the head of their water program to, in effect, be the point person for the state of Wisconsin. All my counterparts in the Wisconsin Superfund program were never involved in this cleanup. We provided a lot of funding to DNR to do that. And when we did sign the first record of decision in 2002, it was a joint record of decision. So Wisconsin bought into the additional dredging that the paper companies didn't want. So I guess maybe it's a statement of all's well that ends well, that Wisconsin bought into the remedy. And after the work got done, I think the relationship was much more cordial. Early on, going through all the steps to get to the record of decision, it was a little confrontational between us and WDNR. All right, I think that's it for me, and turn it over to Jim Honenberg. Jim was just an outstanding RPM. The workload on this site, as you could imagine, was just unbelievable. He really did a yeoman job in managing the site and doing the day-to-day work on getting the rod prepared and getting us to the point where we could actually move into remedial design and remedial implementation. So my hat, as Dave said, is off to Jim for all his hard work on keeping this project moving forward.
Take it away, Jim.
Okay, as Bill indicated, it was a state technical lead, which meant that the state did the most of the technical work. My role was really to make sure they stayed on track in terms of complying with CERCLA and the NPL. But they did a great job. They really did. And this is the largest sediment cleanup, depending on how you define it. In terms of dredge material, it is the largest project ever done anywhere. There are other projects that did move more PCBs, but in terms of sediment remove, we were the tops. Also, we had a large portion. Well, by the way, 6.5 million cubic yards is about the equivalent of 20 stacked Sears towers, to give you a perspective. And then we did do some capping and covering, and the capping and covering were in areas that were generally lower concentration and less liable for erosion. And the cost wasn't cheap. It was about $1 billion paid for by PRPs. There's also about $100 million in work done on the NRD process, and also the company paid for our past cost. And so it ended up to being, with all that, plus monitoring costs in the future, ended up being closer to 1.3 billion when it's all said and done. Next, please. And this was covered earlier by Bill, but it just shows you kind of the timeline of when PCBs were discharged And then the cleanup took about 16 years, from 2004 to 2020. Next, please. And this is just a picture of what the caps were like. And depending on the particular situation in terms of concentration and where the contaminated sediment was located, we had a variety of different caps. Sometimes we had just the stone you see there. Sometimes we had the big stone. That was mostly in the navigation channel. And then in lower concentration areas, a thinner sediment too. Thinner contaminated sediment, we just put sand over. We call that a cover. Next, please. And this is one of the dredges that were used. We usually use about 2 dredges at any one time. And this is the smaller dredge, which had an 8-inch discharge pipe. The larger dredge had about a 12-inch discharge, exactly 12-ounce discharge pipe, and had a 3-foot cutter head. So it was bigger, but we used this dredge in areas that had thinner sediment, and the bigger dredge we use usually in where we had thicker areas and it could really generate a lot of good production from it. Anyway, next, please. And we use 2 different methods of dewatering. Up in OU1 or Little Lake Beatemore, the first 6 miles of river, we use geotextile tubes. And these are big sausages, about 200 feet long. I think they're like 30 feet across, 30 feet in diameter. And you pump them up with sediment that had been dredged, and then the water would drain out. Next slide, please. This is shows the layout of the tubes. Under the tubes, you had gravel, and then you had a water collection pipe under just over some liners, and then you pump off the water and treat it. The tubes. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh yeah, sorry. And once the tubes are dewatered, next, you would chop them up and put them in trucks and destroy the tubes, but dig up the sediment and then take them off to a landfill. The solids content after dewatering here is about 35%, which doesn't sound that high, but it actually is pretty solid. Next slide, please. Now, downriver, we use plate and frame presses, and that process was more expensive, but it get a much higher solid content. Instead of 35%, it was 55%, which greatly reduced disposal cost. So, but that was used, and the difference between the plate and frame presses and the geotubes was the plate and frame presses had a much smaller footprint. Plate and frames were in a building, which was pretty big, but the geotubes, we actually had about 6 acres of tubes on top of the gravel, and we stacked them three high there. Next, please. And then after dewatering, we'd haul them off about 20 miles to a disposal facility, put most of the PCBs into a regular landfill. And some of them did go to a TSCA facility, not that much. And then we had another facility, which was not TSCA exactly, but had a special permit, which had a little higher concentrations of PCBs. So that's where they went. Next, please. Now, the benefits, of course, river improvement was substantial in terms of fish consumption in particular. Ecosystems improved. It resulted in better tourism, better recreation, and riverfront development in recent years. In fact, Green Bay was listed as one of the top livable cities in the United States. And I have to believe that a lot of that relates to riverfront development. And the riverfront development, while the river really doesn't look much different, I think people's perception of it, and that it is no longer a toxic site, it lends itself to people being more interested to do that. The other thing, Bill mentioned the economic impacts. Of course, the companies had to spend a lot of money, but that money just didn't go away. Contractors spent a lot of the money, most money really, in the communities with different hotels, supplies, homes, things like that. Next, please. Finally, the environmental results are really quite excellent. upstream, we're approaching unlimited fish consumption, particularly for the walleye, as well as other species like carp and other fish. We have 90% reduction in the sediment concentration. And one thing we haven't talked about is the restoration projects under the NRD process. That has been done with about $100 million from the PRPs also. Next might be it. Yeah, and that's all I have to say.
Okay, very good, Jim. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Moving right along, one of the toughest jobs in a lot of these cleanups was riding herd on the lawyers. And Roger Grimes was in charge of that for the EPA team. And Roger, tell us a little bit about the dynamic of working on the legal side of this.
Sure. Well, I was, as Dave said, I was at EPA from 75 till I retired in 2004. And I really consider it my good fortune to have been assigned to this particular case. It was a big, thorny case, lots of parties, just a ton of lawyers from every conceivable perspective, lots of stakeholders. So Dave is right. Riding herd on this whole thing, it didn't entirely fall to me, but I certainly had a part in it. In terms of the legal dynamics, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Superfund as some of the others, it's a strict joint and several liability statute, meaning that each of the responsible parties is in fact liable for the whole cleanup. And that introduces some real sort of unusual dynamics because the group, the Fox River group, all represented by lawyers all the time. The attorneys, of course, want to coalesce around certain positions and present a united front to the government. Well, at the same time, every dollar that gets spent by one PRP is a dollar that doesn't have to get spent by another PRP. So the result is they have sort of conflicting incentives, one of which is to present this unified front to the government. And on the other hand, this might not be the best phrasing, but they're kind of stabbing each other in the back, trying to throw liability from one PRP to another. So they're together in some senses and they're at odds in other senses. And when we would go into negotiating sessions for consent decrees and that sort of thing, you could sort of sense this. And as it turned out, there was one particular lawyer who was pretty litigious, and I could sense anyway that most of the lawyers on the other side really didn't care for this guy. And you would sort of hear comments in the hallways between sessions and that kind of thing. But I think that sort of worked against them as a group. But nonetheless, they had these conflicting incentives. And it led to some sort of interesting dynamics among the attorneys. Jim and I, on the other hand, and everybody working for the government, were in a much different position. We were there to protect the public interest and to find the right environmental solution. So, and it was always nice to be able to go into a meeting with the attorneys from the other side or in front of a court and be able to say, we are here representing the public interest and we want the right solution, and we are less concerned, not totally unconcerned, but less concerned about the overall costs. Whereas the responsible parties really had costs in mind at the top of mind most of the time. And one example of this would be that this natural recovery that you heard Bill and Jim bring up a little bit. The PRPs paid some very reputable, highly credentialed engineering firms to support what they thought was the correct solution, if you will, which was not to do anything. They said, well, the sediments are all, the PCBs are all down there in the sediments, and any technology that you use to go in there and try to extract the sediments is just going to release them more. They're going to flow down the river. They're going to go out into Green Bay, where they are effectively lost lost in the environment, and there is no technology to recapture them. So Jim and I could go into these negotiating sessions along with the Department of Justice attorneys, who were excellent, by the way. And we could sort of wear the white hats, and I always sort of like being in that position. Bill mentioned the multitude of comments we got through this as the Superfund process wound along, and some of those comments were that we weren't doing enough. Whereas, of course, the companies and other people were saying we were doing too much. But being in between those 2 points of view made me think that we were somewhere in the right area. And I believe, based on the outcome of the whole cleanup process, I think we were in about the right area. One of the things that I was probably more naive back then than I am now, was that, and one of the things that sort of surprised me was that the responsible parties could pay, it seemed like, unlimited amounts of money to highly reputable engineering firms. And the lesson that I learned was, for the right amount of money, you can get an expert to say almost anything. And these engineering firms would come in and they strongly tried to strongly support just the do nothing solution. Anyway, that was kind of an aside. It surprised me at the time, but not so much anymore. Effectively, if you step back and look at this in a macro view, the companies I saw an earlier slide that said that they were discharging between 1954 and 71. And during that time, the companies were very profitable. They made a huge amount of money. I don't know how much, but they were very profitable. And all the while, they were discharging PCBs. And you saw the picture of the cross-billed cormorant. That is sort of symbolic of the fact that the environment, from the benthic community down under the sediments, all the way up through the high level fish, the walleye, for example, and the birds, the migratory birds, the tourist industry, all of these economic interests were in some senses subsidizing these paper companies that were making lots of money. And so that was, if you step back and see that, I don't think that's unique to the Fox River, but it is kind of how things worked out, I believe. And let's see if I've overlooked anything. One of the early on, I said I was fortunate to get assigned to this case, and I knew, for example, I knew it was a big case when a UCLA law professor called me up one day and said that his law class was following this case, and he wanted some extra information, which I was able to send to him. So I consider it I consider myself very fortunate to have been assigned to this case and to work with Jim and Bill and Dave on this case for these years. And so that's the end of my particular portion of this.
Well, very good, Roger. Thanks very much. And to Bill, Jim, and Roger, we really appreciate what you did on the Fox River. I know the people of Wisconsin do. For those of you who don't know, walleye fishing in Wisconsin is about as close to a religion as you can get, maybe up there with deer hunting and then something more formal than that. But it's really important in the fact that you're getting close to being able to have a unlimited number of walleye meals in Wisconsin for that Friday night fish fry with cheese curds and a brandy old fashioned. It's pretty big stuff. We had a couple of questions come in. Jim, one narrow one. Where was the disposal site that was ultimately selected?
There are 3 sites. One is the town of Chilton, which is east of Appleton and the southwest of Green Bay, about 20 miles from Green Bay. They're also early in the project for the demonstration projects. PCBs that were Tosca material went to Model City in Michigan. And there's a third one, which I can't remember the name of the town, but it was southeast of Green Bay, maybe 10 or 15 miles. And that's where the sediment, they had PCBs that were not exactly Tosca for the most part, but they're still higher than you wanted to send to a regular landfill. So there are 3 sites, but most of the sediment went to the town of Chilton, big disposal facility there, which is just a regular landfill.
Jim, were those fairly well accepted, or was there a lot of resistance to the siting there?
They're pretty well accepted, really. Surprisingly, there wasn't much resistance. A lot of times there is, but the one facility that had the semi-Tosca material, there's a little bit of controversy, but not that much, surprisingly. Yeah, a lot of times there is, but no, it was okay.
Well, as much of the audience would know, the state-federal dynamic is always an interesting one. I had a little part in that when our regional administrator left in 1996 to return to Lithuania and become a president of Lithuania. I stepped in as acting, and one of the first things I did was sign a letter to the governor of Wisconsin saying, you know, you've had a long enough time to try to get the cleanup on the Fox, and you know, the party's over, we're going to get involved. Well, there was quite a strong response to that, but we got beyond that, and I would add that there was a nice dynamic between Fish and Wildlife and the natural resource damage assessment in our work. And I don't know, Jim, did you give a dollar figure on what went into natural resource damage or natural resource
restoration? I don't know what they spent for their investigation, but they got $100 million in damages, which is a lot for an NRD.
Another interesting dynamic, and I'd ask each of the 3 of you to comment a little bit, is the, I'll call it the cultural dynamic. Native American tribes were very interested and involved in that area, the Oneidas and the Menominees, as well as a large Hmong population that has fish as a large part of its diet. I don't know who I might want to go first to talk a little bit about how that was handled. Bill, it looks like you're...
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That was interesting. I neglected to actually mention that when we're talking about the impacts on human health, because fishing was such a large part of the local environment. And church groups in Wisconsin brought over these people called the Hmong people from Southeast Asia, and their whole culture was subsistence by fishing. they did not speak English when they came over. And we were very, very concerned about the health impacts on these people to try to get them to stop, catching and eating fish. Pretty much the whole 39 miles was posted with, do not eat fish. They're, contaminated. Signs were translated into the Hmong language, but we had difficulty trying to convince them because of the strong cultural background that fishing played in their lives, to get them to stop eating the fish until the cleanup was in fact completed. So that was a real challenge. And in Superfund, we have community involvement coordinators that get involved to try to deal with the local communities. And then here we had multiple communities over the 39-mile stretch of the river. We had different towns, as Dave mentioned, 2 tribes, then Hmong people, and they really spent a lot of time and effort, in the field trying to get the message across that until the remedy is implemented, that fishing needed to stop. Now, you're never 100% successful, but hopefully, we were able to try to at least protect their health to some degree by getting them, getting the word out that they should stop eating the fish.
Roger or Jim, anything to add to that, or the tribal element?
Not too much, but the Hmong didn't think it was a big deal in terms of the PCBs. They really didn't think it was that important, because they are what we call subsistence fishers in risk assessments. So, was their livelihood. So it's kind of hard for them to accept the idea that they shouldn't eat them.
One recollection that I have that's seared into my mind was a meeting we had on the natural resource damages, and there was a gentleman whose name I don't recall. He was from one of the tribes, and he showed up, and he was a very strong personality. Maybe one of you other guys remembers.
Sinaquat.
Apasanaquat, yeah, right.
Yeah, he was.
And he came to this meeting, and here's all these lawyers sitting around, and they got their expensive suits on. And this guy's, he had not a feather in his hair, but, beads or something. And he was a powerful personality.
Yeah.
And he says, you people put those PCBs in the river and you get them out. And I think that impressed those $500 an hour lawyers. I'll tell you.
He had charisma.
Yeah, he
actually
did.
Apasanaquat starred in a couple of movies.
Babylon.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah. There's a very interesting history behind him and the Menominee reservation, which left reservation status, but then came back to reservation status over the years.
He was a powerful guy.
Yep.
Tribes are great allies for us, really.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. If others have questions they'd like to put into the chat, that would be fine. I'd like to get into I'll call it the state-federal dynamic, if you will. And all of you alluded to that. I had a little taste of that at the outset, and as it went forward, and as a former cheesehead who went bad and went south to Chicago, I had a more than passing interest. I don't know, any of you, all of you, what was the key to really making that dynamic eventually work? Bill, thoughts on that?
I think it was just, to put it bluntly, it was like wearing them down. That they came in with one position, and like I said, which was more supportive of the paper company remedy. We did our own risk assessment and remedial investigation and FS feasibility study for the remedy. And, you know, little by little, we wore them down. But I mean, we had numerous meetings, I mean, that I was in with them. And I know that Jim and Roger were kind of dealing with them pretty much, you know, daily, weekly basis. And little by little, they kind of got the message that we weren't going to go away. So I think it was just over a period of time that they eventually capitulated to.
I think my cynical view is when they realized we had the resources that we did, particularly the checkbook to help them with doing the RFS, and that we would give them the lead. That got them a lot more willing to cooperate with us. And once we got going on that, things developed quite well in terms of the technical people, the staff people, all were kind of on the same page, and we really started working together really well.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. Yeah.
Jim, in the implementation of the remedy, what was there any particular technical problem that presented itself that was especially hard to resolve? And if so, how did you go about resolving?
In the actual implementation, there are a lot of little things, but thank goodness DNR, under oversight, hired a contractor, which I admit I was skeptical to start with, was Bolt, which is a big construction company in Wisconsin. I thought, I don't know, because they're, you know, a company that didn't do environmental work, but they were really, really good with looking at the engineering, coming up with constructive solutions and working with the companies, and at the same time taking kind of our perspective of having to comply with the ROD and all that kind of thing. So DNR actually did a really good job when it was all said and done. Earlier on, I'll admit our relationship was not real smooth. You know, we didn't have a lot of goodwill feeling between us, but as time went on, it really improved.
And, you know, the good thing was that once we got the consent decree approved, signed by the judge, the standard language is that the paper companies have to, you know, reimburse us for our oversight costs and the Wisconsin oversight costs. So that Wisconsin, you know, in effect, they were using free money to do the oversight. And I think that helped them quite a bit. Prior to that, again, everyone was sort of paying for any work on this out of their own dime. And Wisconsin, I think, didn't want to do much prior to that. But once we got the consent decree and they were able to get reimbursed for all their oversight costs, things went a lot better, as Jim said.
And one thing we had, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say it was kind of a formality, but it turned out that really helped get us on the same page is we had a cooperative agreement between all the agencies, including DNR. And when that was signed, all the parties took it pretty seriously that we really would work together. And that sounds like kind of a formality, but it seemed to make a difference. And
Raj, did you have something to add to that?
Well, just the point that the question had to do with whether there was any particular technological issue that was more difficult than others. And Hannenberg always did his homework, always. And he knew everything about every technical issue. And just his impact on all the technical people in the meetings was substantial. And they knew if Hannenberg said it, yeah, it's probably right. And the result was I didn't hear Jim say a particular technical issue that was especially difficult, but the reason was Hannenberg knew his stuff.
Well, there was a tension between how much dredging and how much capping we should do.
Yeah.
Of course, the companies always wanted to do more capping, we wanted more dredging. But we came to a middle ground with that. And we ended up dredging areas that had the higher concentrations were more likely to be eroded. The capping was done in the lower concentration areas.
And that brings to mind another point, and that is when the other side is right and you concede a little bit,
right.
it just strengthens your own position. So, and that compromise on the capping and the dredging, I think, worked in our favor.
And one thing that really helped us on the technical side was the contractors that DNR had hired, both. They were really good engineers, and they knew how to manage big projects because that's what they do. But that was really good too.
You know, it's interesting just thinking back and working on water cases, air cases, super fun. You know, there's always the big battles up front and, you know, with the responsible parties and sometimes with the state. And I always found that once you got to the point that there's an agreement on what needs to be done, everybody kind of buys into it and goes forward with it. And, you know, sometimes problems pop up, but usually once you get that momentum of, okay, we're in the cleanup stage, we're in this together, things are going to be better when we're done. Let's make this work. So
in that regard, you're right, absolutely right, because the companies realize time is money.
Yep.
And the quicker they get it done and sufficiently, and
it's okay. We're back in COVID time.
yes,
It helps to have a federal judge and a consent decree on your side too.
Yep. Yep. I am sure that is a big help. There was a question that came in from Gary Tim about splitting the cost, and he thought it might have been a little easier. He talked about Tosca cases. Any of you, do you know how the PRPs ultimately decided how to split the costs? Was it on PCBs discharge or?
No,
I don't.
no.
Yeah, whatever it was, they finally agreed, I guess.
NCR did the lion's share, I think, though, of paying it. Well, they did the most work.
Okay, there was
Sorry.
any thoughts as to why the region did not pursue penalties for any of the PRP's instances of unilateral order non-compliance?
Well, it's complied.
Well, I don't think we had a unilateral order at any point in time. It wasn't until we got the federal court consent decree that we had some leverage, some enforceable leverage over them. And at that point in time, I think the PRP group was resigned to the fact that they're going to have to, you know, spend the money and do the work. And there really wasn't any you know, major non-compliance or disputes in terms of the remedial design or implementing the remedies. Isn't that correct, Jim? I mean, the paper companies,
we did issue one UAO for completion of 56, 57 dredging. Otherwise, you're right, it was consent decrees all the way.
That 56, 57, that was a pilot project.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
DNR started it and we finished it.
Yeah.
Well, generally Region 5 was not accused of being soft on enforcement, so I'm sure if there were some egregious behaviors there that we would have pounced on them. Well, we're at the end of our time now. Jim, Bill, Roger, really appreciate it. Jim, particularly the personal touch at the end with, what's the kitty's name?
Kuro. Sorry.
Okay, well, very good, very good. And Beth, help me out. Do we have breakout chat rooms afterwards if people are interested, or are we just signing off?
We have the breakout rooms and Chuck is going to run it.
Okay, well, anyone who is interested either in continuing a discussion about the Fox River PCB cleanups, kitty cats, or anything related to it, are welcome to stay on. You'll be randomly assigned to a chat room. And but again, thanks to our speakers, thanks to the audience. We owe the three of you a great debt of gratitude for what you did for the Fox River, the people of Wisconsin, the people of the Great Lakes, and especially the walleye anglers who are up there. So Thanks a lot.